First Geronimo, then Cochise, and now the bloodiest Apache of the...
Censors banned one of these in multiple countries for a massacre scene, so graphic audiences walked out vomiting. Another Western got slapped with an X rating for showing what scalping actually looks like. Sam Peckinpah's Bloodbath rewrote the rules. On-screen violence and still got butchered by studios terrified of the backlash. One director claimed his film was historically accurate, then admitted years later he just wanted to make the most violent Western ever filmed. These are 11 censored Westerns that were too violent for the 1970s. Number 11. Chato's Land. Michael Winner directed this revenge Western, starring Charles Bronson as a half-breed Apache who kills a racist sheriff in self-defense, then gets hunted across the desert by a posse of wealthy white men, treating it like a sporting event. The film is brutal, ugly, and absolutely unrelenting in its violence. The winner did not hold back, and censors around the world lost their minds. The movie opens with Bronson shooting a man in a saloon, then cuts to the posse tracking him through Apache territory. What starts as a manhunt turns into a massacre. Bronson picks off the hunters one by one using traps, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics. He is not a hero. He is a survivor using every dirty trick he knows to kill the men trying to kill him. The violence is what got Chato's Land in trouble. Winner filmed graphic scalpings, torture scenes, and a prolonged sexual assault that censors in multiple countries demanded be cut. The British Board of Film Classification initially refused to give it a certificate at all. Winner had to trim several scenes just to get it released. And even then, it came out with an X rating. The rape scene specifically caused outrage. The posse captures Chato's wife, and several men assault her while Bronson's character watches helplessly from a distance. Winner claimed it was necessary to show the depths of the posse's depravity, but critics called it exploitative and gratuitous. Several countries cut the scene entirely, and others banned the film outright. What makes Chato's Land even more controversial is its racial politics. The white characters are portrayed as sadistic, cowardly monsters. The Apache protagonist is silent, brutal, and shows zero mercy. Winner was not interested in making anyone sympathetic. He wanted to show frontier violence for what it really was, and audiences were not ready for it. Jack Palance plays the leader of the posse, and even he is not given any redemptive qualities. He watches his men commit atrocities and does nothing to stop them. By the end, when Bronson has killed most of the group and left the survivors to die in the desert, you do not feel bad for them. You just feel sick. The film made money in Europe, but barely got released in the United States. American distributors were terrified of the violence and the politics. Critics who did see it were split. Some praised Winner for not sanitizing the Old West. Others accused him of making torture porn disguised as a revenge thriller. Bronson himself rarely talked about the film in interviews, which tells you how uncomfortable even he was with the final product. Number 10. Soldier Blue. Ralph Nelson directed what might be the most notorious Western of the 1970s. Soldier Blue was marketed as a love story set against the Indian Wars, but what audiences got was a blood-soaked recreation of the Sand Creek Massacre that left people running out of theaters. The film ends with the 20-minute genocide sequence so graphic that censors in multiple countries banned it outright. The setup is deceptively simple. Candice Bergen plays a woman traveling west with a cavalry escort when they get attacked by Cheyenne warriors. She and a young soldier, played by Peter Strauss, are the only survivors. They have to make it to a fort on foot while falling in love along the way. Standard Western romance, right? Wrong. The entire first hour is a setup for the massacre. Nelson wanted audiences to get comfortable, to like these characters. So when the cavalry arrives at the Cheyenne village at the end, the horror hits even harder, and it does. Soldiers butcher women and children, hack off limbs, crush babies, commit sexual violence on camera. It is not implied, it is shown. Nelson based the massacre on the real Sand Creek attack in 1864, where Colonel John Chivington led Colorado militia in slaughtering over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women and children. He studied historical accounts and eyewitness testimony to make the scene as accurate as possible. Censors did not care about historical accuracy. They cared that audiences were vomiting in the aisles. The film got an X rating in the United States, same as pornography. The British cut over 10 minutes of footage and still gave it an X. West Germany banned it completely. Australia cut it so heavily the ending barely made sense. Nelson fought back, arguing the violence was necessary to show the truth about American expansion. But distributors were terrified. What really enraged censors was the explicitness. Limbs hacked off in close-up, a soldier swinging a baby by its feet and smashing its head against a rock, a woman's breast cut off and worn as a trophy. Nelson did not cut away. He held the shots, making audiences watch every horrific second. Critics were divided. Roger Ebert gave it 2.5 stars and called it clumsy, but important. Variety said it was anti-American propaganda. The New York Times called it exploitation, disguised as social commentary. The audience stayed away. The film bombed, making less than $1 million domestically, despite a major studio release through Avco Embassy. Decades later, Soldier Blue has been reappraised. Some historians credit it with helping change how Westerns portrayed Native Americans. Others still think Nelson went too far and used real historical trauma as shock value. Either way, it remains one of the most censored Westerns ever made. Number 9. A Man Called Horse. Elliot Silverstein directed this Richard Harris vehicle about an English aristocrat captured by Sioux warriors and forced to live as their slave before eventually earning their respect. The film was praised for its attempt at cultural authenticity, then immediately condemned for its graphic violence and disturbing rituals shown on screen. The most infamous scene is the Sun Vow ceremony, where Harris's character undergoes a brutal initiation. Wooden skewers are shoved through his chest muscles, attached to ropes, and he is suspended in the air while drums pound and he screams in agony. It goes on for minutes. The camera does not look away. Censors around the world lost their minds. Silverstein worked with Native American consultants to make sure the Sun Vow ceremony was depicted accurately. The Sioux confirmed that, yes, this is a real ritual, and yes, it is that painful. But knowing it is authentic did not make censors any more comfortable showing it to audiences. The scene was cut in multiple countries, and the film got slapped with restricted ratings everywhere it played. The violence throughout the film is unflinching. Scalpings are shown in close-up. Torture scenes linger when Harris's character is forced to prove himself by surviving brutal tests. The film does not soften anything. You see every cut, every burn, every moment of suffering. This was not the sanitized Hollywood version of Native American culture. This was Silverstein trying to show it raw. Critics were split on whether the film was respectful or exploitative. Some praised it for not romanticizing Native American life and showing the harshness of survival on the plains. Others accused Silverstein of using cultural practices as torture porn for white audiences. Native American activists had mixed reactions too. Some appreciated the attempted accuracy. Others hated seeing sacred rituals turned into entertainment. Richard Harris defended the film for years. He said the sunbow scene was the most important moment of his career because it showed strength and spirituality in a way Western audiences had never seen. But he also admitted the shoot was hell. The skewers were real, though obviously not piercing his actual skin. And he was genuinely suspended for hours during filming. The film made money despite the controversy. It cost $1.8 million and made over $10 million worldwide. That success led to 2 sequels, both progressively worse and more exploitative. But the original remains controversial. Film schools still debate whether A Man Called Horse was groundbreaking or just another example of white Hollywood, appropriating Native culture for shock value. Number 8. The Hunting Party. Don Medford directed this savage Western starring Oliver Reed, Candice Bergen, and Gene Hackman in one of his nastiest roles ever. The plot is simple. Reed plays an outlaw who kidnaps Bergen. Hackman plays her husband, a sadistic cattle baron, who hunts them across the desert using a high-powered rifle with a telescopic sight. What follows is 2 hours of men getting blown apart from a distance while Hackman laughs about it. The violence in The Hunting Party is clinical and disturbing. Hackman does not fight fair. He shoots men from half a mile away, watches them die through his scope, then rides over to examine the damage. Bodies explode, limbs get torn off, limbs get torn. The film lingers on the carnage in a way that made censors deeply uncomfortable. The telescopic rifle was the problem. Traditional Westerns had gunfights where men faced each other. This film had one man picking off targets like they were animals, and the power imbalance made the violence feel worse. Censors argued it glorified murder. Medford argued it showed the brutality of wealthy men treating human beings as sport. Nobody was happy. The film got butchered in international markets. The BBFC in Britain cut over 4 minutes of violence. Countries across Europe trimmed the shooting scenes. Even the American release got toned down from Medford's original cut, though it still carried a strong R rating and warnings about graphic content. Gene Hackman later called The Hunting Party one of the most unpleasant shoots of his career. He hated playing a character with zero redeeming qualities, and he clashed with Medford over how sadistic he was. Hackman wanted some humanity. Medford wanted pure evil. Medford won, and Hackman spent the entire film sneering and murdering without remorse. Oliver Reed and Candice Bergen did not get along either. Reed was drinking heavily during production, and Bergen found him impossible to work with. The tension shows on screen. Their scenes together feel genuinely hostile, which actually works for the story, but makes filming miserable. The Hunting Party flopped. It made less than $2 million and got savaged by critics. Roger Ebert called it an ugly, pointless exercise in sadism. Variety said it was too violent to be entertaining and too stupid to be taken seriously. Audiences agreed and stayed away. Over time, the film has gained a small cult, a following among fans of brutal 70s westerns, but it remains one of the most heavily censored of the era. Even home video releases struggled to find an uncut version for years because so many different edited prints existed in different markets. Number 7. Cutthroats. 9. Joaquin Luis Romero. Marchant directed this Spanish Western, and it is hands down one of the most vicious, nihilistic, and grotesque Westerns ever made. The entire film takes place in a frozen mountain wilderness where a small group of soldiers are transporting 7 convicted criminals to prison. The journey turns into a nightmare of murder, cannibalism, and betrayal that makes other violent Westerns look tame by comparison. This thing was banned in multiple countries immediately. The violence is not stylized or choreographed. It is ugly and realistic. Men freeze to death on screen. A woman gets sexually assaulted and thrown off a cliff. There is an amputation scene where a man's leg is sawed off with a rusty blade while he screams, and the camera holds on every second of it. The cannibalism is what pushed Cutthroats 9 over the line for most censors. After people start dying, the survivors face starvation in the snow. The film strongly implies, and in some cuts explicitly shows them eating the dead. European censors cut entire sequences. The film was refused classification in the UK until the late 90s. And even then it came out heavily edited. Marchant was inspired by spaghetti westerns, but wanted to strip away any romanticism. No heroic cowboys here. Every character is either a killer, a coward, or both. The few attempts at decency get punished immediately. The message is clear. In the wilderness, morality dies first, and whoever is willing to go the furthest survives. The production was brutal. They filmed in actual mountains during winter with real snow. The cast was freezing, exhausted, and legitimately suffering, which Marchant used to get authentic performances. Robert Hundar, who plays the lead soldier, later said it was the worst filming experience of his life, and he only did it because he needed the money. The film has no score for long stretches, just wind and footsteps crunching in the snow. When music does appear, it is discordant and unsettling. The whole thing feels like a survival horror film disguised as a Western. And audiences in 1972 were absolutely not ready for it. Cutthroats. Nain made almost no money. It got limited releases in Spain and Italy, barely played anywhere else, and disappeared for decades. But among extreme cinema fans and Western completists, it has developed a reputation as one of the hardest, most uncompromising Westerns ever made. If you can find an uncut version, which is still difficult, it remains shocking even by modern standards. Number 6. Ulzana's Raid.
More. Ulzana.
Robert Aldrich directed this brutal Apache war film starring Burt Lancaster, and it might be the most honest, unflinching portrayal of frontier violence ever made. The plot follows a young cavalry officer and a veteran scout tracking a band of Apache warriors who have left the reservation and are cutting a path of destruction across Arizona. The violence is relentless, and Aldrich refused to soften any of it. The film opens with the aftermath of an Apache raid. Bodies mutilated, a woman raped and killed, a man tortured to death. The cavalry arrives too late, and all they can do is bury the dead and start tracking. From there, Ulzana's raid becomes a chase where both sides commit horrific acts, and nobody gets to claim moral superiority. What got Ulzana's raid in trouble with censors was the even-handedness. Aldrich did not portray the Apache as savages or noble victims. He showed them as warriors using terror tactics because that is how they fought. Scalpings, torture, killing civilians, it is all shown on screen. But the cavalry is not much better. They execute prisoners, abandon wounded men, and commit their own atrocities when given the chance. The rape and torture scenes were cut in multiple countries. The MPAA gave it an R rating in the United States, but international censors were harsher. Britain cut several minutes. Australia heavily edited it. Some markets refused to release it at all because the violence felt too real and too ugly. Burt Lancaster plays the scout, a man who has lived with Apaches and understands them. He explains to the young officer that the violence is not random cruelty, it is strategy. The Apache want to spread fear, demoralize the cavalry, and make them hesitate. The film does not judge this, it just presents it as fact, and that moral ambiguity made audiences and censors deeply uncomfortable. Aldrich worked with Native American consultants, and the Apache characters speak in their actual language with subtitles. That was rare for 1972. Most westerns still had white actors playing Indians speaking broken English. Aldrich wanted authenticity, and he got it. The Apache tactics, the cavalry's response, even the landscape, all of it was researched and accurate. The film flopped, made less than $4 million domestic on a $1.2 million budget, which sounds profitable until you factor in marketing and distribution costs. Critics praised it, but audiences stayed away. It was too violent, too bleak, and it did not give anyone a hero to root for. Aldrich later said he was proud of Ulzana's raid, precisely because it made people uncomfortable. He wanted to show what the frontier wars actually looked like, and he succeeded. Censors just made sure most people never got to see his full vision. Number 5. Doc
aren't always beautiful. Into the camera.
Frank Perry directed this revisionist take on the Wyatt Earp legend, and it is one of the ugliest, most cynical westerns ever made. Stacy Keach plays Doc Holliday as a violent, diseased lunatic. Harris Yulin plays Wyatt Earp as a cowardly opportunist. And the famous gunfight at the OK Corral is portrayed as a cold-blooded execution, not a heroic showdown. Censors hated every frame of it. The film came out in 1971, right when westerns were getting darker and more violent. But Doc went further than most. Perry was not interested in mythology. He wanted to destroy it. So he made Tombstone a filthy, disease-ridden hellhole, where everyone is either corrupt, dying, or both. Doc Holliday coughs up blood constantly, Wyatt Earp is a murderous fraud, and the climactic gunfight is just butchery. The OK Corral sequence got the film in serious trouble. Perry shot it documentary style, no music, no heroics. The Earps and Doc walk up to the Clantons and just start shooting. Men get hit and stumble around bleeding. One guy tries to surrender and gets shot anyway. It is over in seconds, and it is brutal. European censors cut the scene down because it felt too much like a snuff film. The violence throughout Doc is grimy and realistic. Men get shot, and they do not die clean. They bleed out slowly, screaming. There is a torture scene where a man gets his fingers broken one by one. A woman is beaten on screen by her pimp. Perry did not glamorize any of it, and audiences walked out disgusted. What made censors even more uncomfortable was the film's total lack of morality. There are no good guys. Doc is a killer who enjoys it. Wyatt is using his badge to steal and murder. The prostitutes are victims. The townspeople are cowards. Nobody learns anything. Nobody gets redeemed, and the film ends with Doc dying alone while Wyatt gets rich off lies about what happened. Stacy Keach later said Doc was one of his favorite roles because it let him play Holliday as a real person, not a romantic hero. But he also admitted the film's nihilism probably destroyed any chance it had with mainstream audiences. Critics were brutal. Roger Ebert gave it 1.5 stars and called it a joyless exercise in demythologizing. Variety said it was too ugly to succeed. The film bombed completely, made less than $1 million domestic. The studio barely promoted it because they knew it would offend Western fans. International releases were heavily cut, and some countries refused to distribute it at all. Perry's career never recovered. He made a few more films, but Doc killed any momentum he had after Diary of a Mad Housewife. For decades, the film was nearly impossible to find. Even home video releases were rare because nobody wanted to touch it. But among revisionist Western fans, Doc has a cult reputation as one of the most uncompromising demythologizing films ever made. Number 4, The Wild Bunch.
Hey, Pike, you know what I hear? I hear they got one of those things up north that can fly.
Sam Peckinpah rewrote the rules on screen violence with The Wild Bunch, and censors around the world immediately tried to rewrite it back. The film follows an aging gang of outlaws in 1913, pulling one last job before the West closes in on them completely. What they get instead is one of the most sustained graphic bloodbaths ever put on film. Squibs explode everywhere, bodies jerk and convulse, and the final battle kills everyone in slow-motion carnage that goes on for minutes. The MPAA gave it an R rating, but barely. Peckinpah had to cut several shots just to avoid an X. The throat-slitting scene got trimmed. Some of the bloodier squib hits were removed. Even in its theatrical cut, The Wild Bunch was the most violent mainstream film ever released in 1969, and it caused absolute chaos. Countries around the world banned it or butchered it. The UK cut over 4 minutes of violence. Germany cut even more. Sweden, a country not known for censorship, cut it heavily. Argentina banned it outright. The film's distributor, Warner Brothers, got nervous and started pulling it from theaters after religious groups and parent organizations screamed about the carnage. Peckinpah fought back hard. He argued the violence was not gratuitous, it was anti-violence. He wanted audiences to feel every bullet, to be exhausted and sickened by the end. He wanted them to understand that violence is not heroic or exciting, it is just ugly. Censors did not care about his intentions. They cared that audiences were watching heads explode in slow motion. The opening scene sets the tone. The bunch robs a railroad office, and it turns into a massacre. Innocent civilians get caught in the crossfire. Children watch people die. An old woman gets trampled. Peckinpah holds on to the chaos, making you watch civilians scream and bleed. Critics called it irresponsible. Peckinpah called it honest. The final battle is legendary. The bunch walks into a Mexican army compound to rescue a captured friend. They kill the general, then the army opens fire. For the next 10 minutes, hundreds of people die on screen. Peckinpah used multiple cameras, shot at different speeds, then edited it all together into this hypnotic dance of death. Squibs explode across bodies, men spin and fall, blood sprays everywhere. Ernest Borgnine, William Holden, Warren Oates, and Ben Johnson play the bunch, and they all defended the film despite the controversy. Holden said it was the most important film he ever made. Borgnine called it Peckinpah's masterpiece. They understood what he was doing even if censors and critics did not. The Wild Bunch made over $10 million domestically despite the cuts and controversy, proving audiences wanted this kind of unflinching violence even if censors did not. Over time, it has been restored to longer cuts, and it is now considered one of the greatest westerns ever made. But in 1969, it was just the most violent, most censored, most controversial film anyone had ever seen. Number 3, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid.
I know where the kid's at. I'll tell you.
Sam Peckinpah's second entry on this list, and it might be even more brutal than The Wild Bunch. The film tells the story of Pat Garrett hunting down his former friend Billy the Kid through New Mexico territory. James Coburn plays Garrett as a haunted sellout. Chris Christopherson plays Billy as a doomed outlaw who knows exactly how this ends. And Peckinpah fills the space between them with some of the most graphic violence of his career. The studio, MGM, butchered the film before release. They hated Peckinpah's cut, thought it was too slow and too violent. So, they took it away from him, recut it, and released a version that made no sense. The theatrical cut was 96 minutes of confusing scenes and random violence. Critics destroyed it. The film bombed. Peckinpah's career never fully recovered. But even in its mangled form, the violence got the film in trouble with censors. There is a scene where a character gets his throat cut and bleeds out slowly on camera. Another where a man gets shot in the stomach and spends minutes dying in agony. Peckinpah did not believe in quick deaths. He made violence slow and painful because that is what it actually is. The most controversial scene involves a group of drifters capturing and torturing Billy's friends. They tie one man up, beat him, then shoot him for fun. Peckinpah filmed it like a lynching, and censors in multiple countries cut it completely. They said it glorified sadism. Peckinpah said it showed what frontier justice really looked like. He was not wrong, but that did not make it any easier to watch. International releases were a mess. The UK cut violence. Europe cut violence. Even the American version was compromised. For decades, nobody saw Peckinpah's real vision for the film. Then, in 2005, Warner Brothers released a restored director's cut at 122 minutes, adding back all the scenes MGM removed. The restored version changed everything. Suddenly, the film made sense. The violence had context. The slow pacing worked. Critics who hated it in 1973 called the restoration a masterpiece. Roger Ebert, who gave the original 2 stars, admitted he was wrong and that Peckinpah's cut was brilliant. Chris Christopherson later said making Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid was a nightmare. Peckinpah was drinking heavily, fighting with the studio constantly, and barely holding it together. Bob Dylan, who did the soundtrack and had a small role, called the shoot complete chaos. But somehow, out of that disaster, Peckinpah made one of the most haunting, violent, and personal westerns ever filmed. The film still carries heavy censorship in some markets. The restored cut is too violent for television in most countries, and streaming versions are often edited. But for fans of Peckinpah and brutal westerns, the full director's cut of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid is essential viewing. Number 2. The Deadly Trackers. Barry Shear directed this Richard Harris revenge western, and it is one of the nastiest, most relentlessly bleak films of the 70s. Harris plays a sheriff whose wife and son are murdered during a bank robbery. He tracks the killers into Mexico and spends the entire film torturing and killing them, one by one. There are no heroes here, just broken men committing atrocities on each other until everyone is dead or insane. The film was originally going to be directed by Sam Fuller, who wrote the script. Fuller wanted to make a hard, realistic western about revenge destroying a man's soul, but he clashed with the producers over budget and creative control, so he walked away. Shear took over and made the film even more violent than Fuller intended, which is saying something. The violence in The Deadly Trackers is cruel and protracted. Men are burned alive. A character gets dragged behind a horse for what feels like minutes. There is a scene where Harris tortures a man by slowly cutting him while asking questions. It is not action violence. It is sadism, filmed in unflinching close-ups. Censors went berserk. The MPAA gave it an R but demanded cuts. International censors chopped it to pieces. The UZ removed over 6 minutes of torture and burning scenes. Australia cut it even more. Several countries refused to release it at all, saying it had no redeeming social value and existed only to depict cruelty. Richard Harris hated the film. He said taking the role was one of the biggest mistakes of his career. He thought he was making a serious meditation on revenge with Fuller. Instead, he ended up in an exploitation film that got cut to hell and bombed anyway. Harris refused to promote it and rarely mentioned it in interviews afterward. Rod Taylor plays the lead outlaw, and he is utterly vile. No charm, no charisma, just pure evil. He kills for fun, tortures for entertainment, and shows zero remorse. The film does not try to explain his behavior or make him interesting. He is just a monster, and watching Harris hunt him is supposed to be cathartic. Instead, it is just exhausting. The film's final message is brutally nihilistic. Harris gets his revenge, but it costs him everything. He becomes worse than the men he hunted. He is left alone, broken, and damned. The film ends with him walking into the desert with nothing, having destroyed himself for vengeance that solved nothing. The Deadly Trackers made almost no money. It was dumped into theaters with minimal promotion, played for a week, and disappeared. Critics who saw it called it ugly, pointless, and sadistic. Fuller disowned it completely, refusing to have his name associated with the final cut. For years, it was nearly impossible to find. Even Western completists avoided it because of its reputation as unwatchable trash. But among extreme cinema fans, The Deadly Trackers has a cult following as one of the most uncompromising, brutal westerns ever made. Number 1. The Great Silence. Sergio Corbucci directed this frozen nightmare of a western, and it is hands down the bleakest, most nihilistic, and most heavily censored western of the era. Set in snow-covered Utah during a blizzard, the film follows a mute gunfighter, played by Jean-Louis Trintignant, trying to protect a group of outlaws from a sadistic bounty hunter played by Klaus Kinski. The film ends with the good guys losing, the villains winning, and absolutely everyone you care about dying horribly. That ending is what got The Great Silence banned in multiple countries. Corbucci shot the heroes getting massacred in cold blood, women and children gunned down, the protagonist shot in the hand, then executed while helpless. The bounty hunters ride away rich and unpunished. Freeze frame, roll credits. Audiences in 1968 lost their minds. Italy, where the film was made, initially refused to release it. Distributors said the ending was too depressing and audiences would riot. Corbucci was forced to shoot an alternate happy ending where the hero survives and the villains die. That version played in some markets, but Corbucci hated it and later buried it. The real ending, his ending, was the massacre. The violence throughout the film is cold and brutal. Bounty hunters shoot unarmed men and collect their bodies for money. A woman is assaulted and murdered. The mute gunfighter kills efficiently, but takes no pleasure in it. Everything happens in freezing snow, which makes the blood spray look even more vivid and horrifying. France cut the ending completely and released a version that just stops before the massacre. Spain edited the violence heavily. The UK refused to give it a certificate until the 1990s. The United States barely released it at all. For decades, The Great Silence was nearly impossible to see in its original form. What makes the film so disturbing is not just the violence, but the message. The law is corrupt. The outlaws are victims. The bounty hunters are legal killers protected by the system. And the hero, despite being faster and better, loses because the villains control the system. Corbucci was making a political statement about power and justice, and censors did not want audiences thinking too hard about that. Klaus Kinski plays the bounty hunter Loco, and he is terrifying, soft-spoken, polite, and absolutely merciless. He explains to his victims exactly why they are about to die, then shoots them without hesitation. Kinski brings this eerie calm to the role that makes him more frightening than if he was just screaming and ranting. The film bombed everywhere it played. Audiences hated the ending. Critics called it nihilistic garbage. Corbucci's career took a hit. But over the decades, The Great Silence has been completely reappraised. Tarantino calls it one of his favorite westerns. Alex Cox made a documentary about it. Film scholars now teach it as a masterpiece of political cinema disguised as a genre film, and it remains the most censored, most banned, and most uncompromising western ever made. The 70s pushed westerns into darker, bloodier territory than ever before. Studios wanted violence, but censors wanted control, and filmmakers got caught in the middle. Some of these films were restored and reappraised, others stayed buried. But they all proved one thing: the Old West was never as clean as Hollywood pretended it was.